Kate Muehlfalter, welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. It's time for our Saturday book, and this week we have a returning author. We're doing another book by D.W. Pasulka. This book is Encounters, Experiences with Non-Human Intelligences, and the other subtitle is Explorations with UFOs, Dreams, Angels, AI, and Other Dimensions. Nothing left out except me. She didn't talk to me. We've read another book by her, American Cosmic. Also a fabulous book. If you haven't caught it, go back and watch the videos. They're there someplace. I'll try to remember to make a playlist, but I don't promise you that I'll remember, and you can remind me. She makes mention of the work of Jacques Vallée because she met him and worked with him. They've had lengthy discussions. So D.W. Pasulka, just to refresh everybody's memory, including my own. And this picture, she looks very young for somebody so smart. Well, wise. She's a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington, and she's written several books. Her research spans Catholic history, specifically mystical experiences, like Fatima and Magia Gorga. All the way from Catholic history to modern day reports of UFOs. Very fascinating. So, let's begin, and let's hope that I can read my handwriting because it's been a little while since I prepared this. And I just offer you a little enticement. This book introduces some really interesting concepts. And as these things often happen, after I read the book, I was listening to a podcast. I had no expectation. That podcast was a long discussion with a man, a scholar, somebody with a very open mind, and he essentially pulls together the work without actually saying this. But I'm making the observation. Pulls together the work of Stefan Schwartz and D.W. Pasulka. And he's agreed to come and speak with us here in a couple of weeks, which is why I really want to get this book read. So, Encounters, Experiences with Non-Human Intelligences, D.W. Pasulka, video number 1. 2023, so it's a new book. And in her introduction, she quotes Carl Jung. UFOs are technological angels. He says that they are symbols and signs of a new epoch in human history. So we're going to be drawing this connection here. As a professor of religious studies, Pasulka, her path to writing about UFOs was unexpected, but it was a natural progression of research into miraculous events, afterlife worlds, aerial beings of light, flying houses, levitating monks and nuns, bilocation, and purgatory. Purgatory being this place you could possibly go to in Catholic belief. After you die, you can go to heaven, always in the presence of God, eternally happy. You can go to hell, always in the presence of the devil, never get to be with God, eternally damned. Bad people go there. Or you can go to purgatory, and purgatory is a little bit like, probation or parole. You kind of work off some of your issues, and then you go to heaven. You don't go from purgatory to hell, but you can go from purgatory to heaven. There's also a fourth state of being after death called limbo. And limbo is where all the good people go who were never baptized Catholic. All the babies who die, before they have a chance to be baptized. All the good pagans. I'm just saying this is what's believed. So UFO belief, she believes, is a growing spirituality, and it basically corresponds to 21st century technology. And, Jacques Vallée kind of made the same connections, which I didn't want to think about when I read his books initially, but I'm beginning to understand the point that they're getting to, which is In the olden days, people had a certain level of understanding of the world around them. There was a lot more superstition involved in their belief systems. And within that context, they defined anomalous experiences. And so they were the gods, they were fairies and elves, they were beings from heaven, angels, saints, levitating, all that kind of thing was defined in a religious or superstitious context. And times change. Now, this is not in the book. This is an observation that I've noticed. And this book kind of explains why it is without knowing that she's explaining why it is. If you look at the depictions of UFOs in our time, starting at, say, the 30s and 40s and 50s, they had a certain style. They were kind of mid-century modern, if you know what I'm saying. And as time has passed, they've become more streamlined, more sleek, more 21st century in a design, actual appearance. I think that's a significant factor. Keep that in the back of your mind. She said this whole situation, as she studied it, turned out to be more complicated than she thought it would be going into it. She found herself interacting as a religious professor with top scientists, with space travelers, with ET experiencers, contact experiencers, with members of intelligence agencies, journalists, and the media. And she saw scientists view UFOs in a spiritual reality, and it kind of shocked her. Her spiritual context was becoming real, conventional. She found first that the public perception of UFOs is often media, and it's where they get it, media. And the media is often an agent of misinformation, and people are manipulated. She also found, to her surprise, that claims about UFOs and contact with UFOs proved to be true. She could not dismiss them or debunk them. Now remember, she has an open mind, but she had no belief about it, which is an interesting approach. She documented what she thought to be these UFO experiences, thought to be a new religious expression, and then she was shocked to see and hear the involvement of Pentagon officials and the military, and the fact that they were admitting secret programs, which they have. So she came to a fork in the road, how to interpret UFOs, and asked herself what or who is silencing this discussion and this information, these stories. And she equated it to the banning of books and the destruction of the Gnostic books that remarkably, I almost said miraculously, remarkably were saved at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were everywhere. That information was everywhere, and it was basically hunted down and destroyed so people would be prevented from knowing it. And she says, boy, is the military, are Pentagon officials basically engaging in the same sort of destruction of information. Why? So she talked to witnesses, like, for example, Dr. Jacques Vallée, who, if you remember the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind? Well, whatever, Close Encounters. There's a scene towards the end where a spaceship lands and the big doors open up and people, ordinary human beings, start coming out of this bright light into down a ramp and into the world. And there's a French scientist who's communicating with the aliens using musical tones on a computer. And that's a whole other subject, a very interesting subject about vibrations and sound and communication. We're going to get to that eventually. Jacques Vallée is who that character is based on. And Valet did effective research. He has a PhD in information science from Northwestern University. He is an astrophysicist. He did technical work for the Department of Defense. Very interesting. And he was close to Dr. Alan Hynek. That name should mean something to you early on in the nexus between UFO experience and the military. He was pivotal. He was a U.S. Air Force UFO consultant. And I'm trying to read my writing. He had information on secret research. Valet was a venture capitalist, so he had all this technical Defense Department, astrophysicist, PhD type background. But he became a venture capitalist and started studying UFOs as a hobby. And he said he was willing to look at disinformation. He said most academics won't. They embrace it as truth. And he says that secrecy and disinformation and misinformation is a murky area, but it's an intrinsic part of U.S. history with UFOs. Most really want to avoid the whole entire topic. Valet understands how disinformation works because he was in the system. And she says, and she agrees with Valet on this, that the best way to study a UFO or the topic of UFOs is with field research. What does that mean? Go talk to witnesses. Go talk one-on-one, face-to-face with experiencers and return to the site of events and investigate. And this approach is not common in the area of UFOs, which is why I strongly recommend the podcast UFO Chronicles. Now, let's face it, these experiences these days are actually ubiquitous. Numbers have mounted over time. It would be really difficult to speak to every single person who's ever had a UFO experience. So in this podcast, this man receives information. People get in touch with him and say, "Can I tell my story?" And he provides them a platform. He just sits and listens. He doesn't make a lot of comment. He lets them tell their entire story, and it really is remarkable. And a couple of my guests here, I discovered first listening to their story on UFO Chronicles. So if you like the kind of guests I've brought on about the UFO topic, listen to UFO Chronicles and keep this little thought in the back of your mind. It's remarkable how many of them are pilots, military, scientists. It's kind of remarkable. So Valet put primary priority on eyewitnesses, which seems self-evident, but okay. And he especially liked to talk to those who had never been interviewed before, because they had not been polarized, as he puts it. They weren't put on the defensive. They kept their stories to themselves, and she agrees with this. Her view is that non-witnesses are informed by media and the culture, and therefore human-like ETs traveling around are like they're in sports cars in these spaceships. Valet writes about a very narrow media approach to this, a very narrow media interpretation, and says the culture is so affected by that image of the E.T. Gray on the cover of Stryber's book Communion that witnesses are not describing necessarily, when witnesses are not describing that image of the gray, they're dismissed by researchers. But that's one type of experience. That's not the definitive for everybody. What Valet is saying is our culture has been propagandized into believing that the only kind of ET is the gray, and the only valid experience echoes what Stryber talked about in his book and looks like what he depicted on the cover. Anything deviating from that is dismissed. And so the media shapes how we view contact, how UFO scenarios are accepted and analyzed. So researchers focus on those that are existing. Researchers focus on the UFO as technology that's advanced, or they only consider the experiences of subjective narrative, and they're not putting the two parts together. But the truth is, these experiences are encounters with reality, a reality that's not compatible with our reality. It's very hard for us to wrap our brains around. And the other factor that's not discussed a lot, I feel like it is, but that's because I kind of read about, I'm into the niche resources about UFO experience. So I was aware of this, and I was surprised that the larger population is not aware of this. And this is something really important about UFO experiencers. They don't walk away unscathed. Yeah, everybody knows, they have a certain degree of trauma or whatever, but there's a huge percentage who they walk away with advanced or enhanced psychic abilities like precognition. And she says this is not strange and this is not abnormal. She says that what happens is they get a shift in perspective. She says she's seen in religious traditions and indigenous lore exactly the same thing. People will go through a mystical experience defined as a religious experience and come out of it with clairaudience. They'll hear communication from angels and saints, or clairvoyance. They'll see images. They'll see apparitions. There are rumors, stories of people who've experienced religious experiences who have developed the ability to teleport. They could be seen in more than one place at a time. So these are not unusual. And we all know that indigenous lore is just chock full of it. They completely accept this. Australian, Aboriginal lore, Native American lore, Latin American Native lore, Northern American Northern and Southern American Native lore. It's everywhere. So she points to something really interesting. John Mack's book, Abduction. I have that. I should have brought it up here. I forgot it was mentioned. And at first, these experiencers were really, really shocked. But later, and they were shocked, and the story was shocking for others to hear. But later, we began to realize that most human societies of the past knew that people have these experiences. How they define them, the context they have experienced them in, will color their interpretation. But they're all of the same cloth. Many indigenous cultures have a framework for understanding it, and they're more comfortable with it. And the important thing is, she says, they don't pathologize it. It's not considered mental illness. For example, the Lakota talk all the time about contact with star nations, ETs. The distinction between natural and spiritual, which is basic polarization of European thought, is meaningless to the Lakota. They don't make a distinction. It's all a part of a larger greatness. In 2018, she said she had an illuminating discussion, good choice of words. SETI, the organization that's trying to contact, with sound, I guess, big dishes, trying to contact life, intelligent life. They had the Breakthrough Listen initiative, and they worked with scholars of indigenous studies. I think that's significant. SETI asked them, what would you want SETI scientists to know about potentially making contact? A very smart question to ask, and the right people to ask. But then, of course, SETI had to spoil it by setting limits. They said, avoid commentary about whether contact's already begun. And in these native cultures, from the beginning of time, we've had continuous, unbroken contact in their belief system. And SETI was like, no, let's pretend that's never happened. How are we going to get in touch with them? And the indigenous people would not misrepresent their cultural knowledge. They believe that contact is an ongoing reality for indigenous communities. Also an ongoing reality for religious traditions. So this is really interesting. Now I want to make it clear, I'm not an apologist for any religion, and I am not an indigenous person. Well, not from there. I'm indigenous to someplace else. I don't have a horse in this race. I'm open-minded about the exploration of these ideas. I think it's fascinating that they're finding a link between mystical experiences, indigenous cultural foundations, and ETs. It's great stuff. So they believe, the indigenous people believe that contact has been ongoing from the beginning of time. And the group from SETI who was meeting with them to try to broaden their perspective, they would not acknowledge this information. And her question is, why not? And it's because SETI is very informed. It's kind of grounded in the media view. It's a confirmation bias. Indigenous and religious contact doesn't match the media version of what this is all about. Popular culture, Western culture, and popular media, their approach is based on fear. They are afraid of eradicating religious belief. They're afraid of people. If the government admits that there's been contact, everyone will flee from their churches and all these cults will start and people will lose their minds. And they're afraid of social mayhem. They just don't want to contribute to chaos. Most religious traditions include the existence and or contact with non-human intelligence. Call it what you want. Angels, saints, ghosts, ETs, whatever. Interdimensional. What's an ET? Technically extraterrestrial means off Earth, outside the Earth, but outside where? So scholars feared that this would make people lose faith in God. And after all, faith in God is a great control factor, isn't it? That it would make people lose faith in God and faith in the afterlife if ETs came with technology that was so advanced that we believed them if they said there's no God. What would people do? This is the question she's asking. She's not making any assertions. Obviously, she's a professor of religious studies. I'm sure she's got a belief system. She's also a Catholic. So that's where she's coming from. She began her evolving research into this, starting with mystical experiences of Catholics, in Fatima, Lourdes, Medjugorje, I can never say it right, in Yugoslavia. So the question she asks, and these are great questions, why is the media so slanted? Why are the media so slanted? What are we afraid of from contact? Are we afraid we're going to meet beings like us? Are we acting from a primal fear of colonization? Because that never goes well. Colonization like we perpetrate. And are we afraid of violence and subjugation? Are we afraid of losing all control and hegemony over our own world? So she found that scientists who are willing to study UFOs, they don't harbor these kind of fears. They're fearless. They believe, like the indigenous people do, that we're already in a state of contact. It is a lived reality. When it began, probably from the beginning. And some of these scientists still prefer to be anonymous. It's very difficult to work within conventional science and harbor these interests, beliefs, or questions. Sorry, I kicked my table. So an example is a guy called Tyler Each, and this is not his real name, and we're going to be referring to him throughout the book. So Tyler is an anonymous scientist. Somebody who's not anonymous and a well-known scientist is Dr. Gary Nolan. And some of us are stuck in this linear timeline of an uncivilized indigenous past and settlers, and then a future with people that are advanced and going to Mars and colonizing Mars and then meeting ETs. We have this linear chronological evolution of human interrelationship and then contact with extraterrestrials. So she said that something that's really important, that really helped her understanding, is what she calls listening to places, which, not necessarily in the book, but just my comment. Think of crop circles, think of ley lines, think of monolithic sites, Stonehenge, Newgrange, Machu Picchu. Think of, go to Herculaneum, go to Pompeii. There's a sense, a weight, an energy of the past. And some of these places are remarkable. Roswell, that's Native American significance there. This is not just a random place where stuff happened in modern times. She says two places really led to her increased understanding. The first is San Agustin in New Mexico, the location of a UFO crash around 1947. She said this site is associated with atomic bomb sites, and that's no coincidence either. Yeah, they picked remote desert-like areas. But what is it about these places? This is her question. And another place is the Vatican Observatory. She said it's the apex of Western religious colonial culture. I thought it was a great observation about the observatory. She calls this the study of this topic here today, the study of a new global cosmism, the cosmic evolution of humans. Let's take ETs, let's take UFO contactees, let's take this whole thing, let's take religious experiences, let's take indigenous knowledge, and let's stir it up in the same pot and acknowledge that this is just part of a larger evolution of humankind. Certain places are primary sites of revelation, and the earth itself, Gaia, is one. And she doesn't use the word Gaia, but she doesn't need to. We know what she's talking about. The entire planetary orb is one of these sites of revelation. That's why we're here. We chose to be here on this planet as opposed to elsewhere. The energy is conducive to revelation, evolution of our souls. She says humans are now exploring other spaces, cosmic and virtual. This is where this book gets really interesting and leads us to our guest coming up. She says we are being introduced to new ways of thinking and being, and those are leading to new forms of consciousness. And she says, she makes it quite clear, I'm not referring to the age of Aquarius. So very much like Stefan Schwartz, I hope he doesn't mind if I speak for him, these people, Dr. Pasulka, Stefan Schwartz, they're not necessarily looking at this from kind of a new age, dare I say, touchy-feely sort of way. They're looking at this from a much more analytical, intellectual point of view. But we're all agreeing on the same thing, which I find utterly fascinating. So we're not talking about the age of Aquarius, but yeah, we are, but we're not. Anyway, she says that it means that there's a novel brain state. There are novel brain states and consciousness associated with space and virtual environments. And she talks about what she means a bit. Dr. Aya Whitley. Now, this is an interesting woman. She's a space psychologist, and she works with the English Space Agency astronauts to develop their own rules and cultures because they're often at odds with mission control. So the guys, meaning girls and boys, who get in the spacecraft for countries, and go out into the unknown, space exploration, they have experiences and a culture, an awareness that's a frame of reference completely different from the guys in mission control, pushing all the buttons and telling them what to do. And this psychologist works with them based on the experiences of previous astronauts and helps them to prepare and when they return to cope. So she says, Pasulka, Dr. Pasulka, the writer of this book, says that this is indicative of a paradigm shift in consciousness, global consciousness. These astronauts are experiencing a little bit about what we're all going through in a more advanced way because they have the opportunity. And it's a shift in consciousness and understanding of space, shift with respect to space. So this doctor helped eliminate the stigma of pilots and astronauts talking about the anomalous phenomena they experience. They are under strict rules, non-disclosure agreements with NASA and the government, national security folks, not to talk. And she's trying to get rid of that stigma. She's been working with all those entities, intelligence, government, NASA, and the experiencers, the astronauts themselves, and plane pilots who experience it too. And she helps them to process these experiences. She uses knowledge of indigenous practices. She's created a program of communication with intelligent non-human life around us based on ancient knowledge. And she's developed a technique to transcribe animal language. And this book will discuss the experiences of what? ET contact? What? There's no answer. This is something that the understanding of it is unfolding. So if you're hoping that by the end of this book we're going to know exactly what we're talking about, no. We're exploring the ideas, we're discussing the experiences, and we're trying to grasp understanding. And I think, although I don't think she says this in this book, I think it's important to acknowledge that our poor little brains, this is a lot. But that's the fun. She says scientists don't know. Scientists don't know what's going on. They'd like to pretend they do, but they don't. They do know that there's intelligence out there. They do know that these non-human aerial vehicles, which are called UFOs or UAPs, they're an intelligent technology. Or are they technology? Or are mystical experiences just an interpretation of technology we don't understand? This is where it gets interesting, confusing, and hard to understand, but absolutely fascinating. She says one of the things that these guys also report is vivid dreams, a sense of non-linear time. So past, present, future, mishmash together. That's a technical term. And precognition, they often experience all of this, but in the past they haven't been reported because they don't fit into the common expectation of both what the officials want to hear, NASA, military intelligence, governments, and they don't fit into the expectations of what the public regards as conventional ET experience, if we can call it that. We're not necessarily, in a broad sense, most people are not thinking, oh, ET contact, oh yes, psychic ability. They don't make the connection. There's a huge, statistically measurable connection. So it's been discussed, these sources, these pilots, these astronauts, and these official groups, NASA, SETI. They talked with the author here, Dr. Pasulka, and then Dr. Ila Whitley, the woman who's so remarkable. She says that we need to discard our preconceived media-inspired expectations and understand that these are realities that have been here for thousands of years. Let me just add, we're still in the introduction here. She says the book also discusses the work of anonymous researchers, scientists looking at religious and spiritual aspects of alien contact. Scientists looking at this. The book explores the experiences of Jose, for example. Now, a lot of people are going to be careful about identifying themselves. Jose is a U.S. Marine, a UFO experiencer in his childhood in Texas and in New Mexico, and he describes his experience, I'm not sure if that's the right word, his information that he received of an organic network, as in Dujardin, Teilhard de Dujardin, there's a name I just butchered, the French philosopher. We studied him in college. I don't even remember any of it because, it crossed my eyes. I was too busy having fun to think about it. I recently got a used copy of his book. I was hoping to cover it. I read the first paragraph and I thought, oh my God, I don't think I can do this. Anyway, he believed that there was an Earth atmosphere of information. Now, who does that sound like? That sounds like Stefan Schwartz's belief in a non-local consciousness, information in the field, Carl Jung's idea of a noosphere, the Greeks' belief in the ether, all the same. So this agrees with indigenous knowledge that was collected by Whitley. She made an intensive study. The book looks at this and the intersection of artificial intelligence and the DARPA branch of the Department of Defense. There's three things you don't think of in the same sentence: indigenous understanding of consciousness, DARPA, and the Department of Defense with AI. And it talks about the belief that ETs are here, but they come from outside space-time, which really, space-time have no meaning. And some believe that extraterrestrials are from another galaxy, and some think they're from another dimension, and some think, well, who knows. But they're a non-human intelligence. There is that agreement. They're outside the dimension of space and time, and also the belief that there's an organic network of information around us, and I think that's sort of the two givens the book is based on. She talks about downloads, and she says this is spontaneously received information coming from, good question, and the belief that someday artificial intelligence will be sentient. And this is the part of the book that I really struggled both to understand and to accept, and strangely, synchronistically, immediately heard the conversation of our future guest that kind of explained a lot of it. So stay tuned. That's not my deceptive way of getting you to come back. It really is fascinating how these topics follow one after another. And She believes that AI represents humans from the future that we interpret, these ET things, humans from the future that we interpret as aliens because we don't really understand what we're looking at. The book discusses government intelligence. It's been managing the public perception of UFOs since the 50s at least. And finally, the government has admitted that that's exactly what's been going on. But, most people are not even aware that this has been admitted officially by the Pentagon, by the government, and that it really did happen. Project Stargate was a thing. So the author met many people that were involved in this secret space program. And this woman, conventional, she's a devout Roman Catholic religious professor. You can't get a whole lot more conventional than that. And she met people who worked in the secret space program, and she believed them. And finally, the book discusses UFO experiences of Ren Filippi, who was an atheist. Filippo, I know I got the name wrong, but we will return to it. She says his experiences include the best overall example from all of the thousands that she's heard. He talks about contacts within their context and the effects that these had. This led him to an entire spiritual transformation. So she began her book with a lot of conventional assumptions. As I said, she's a very conventional person, but somebody with an open mind. So important. She said she believed UFOs were flying saucers from other planets. Most people have that attitude. And she did not expect to meet mystical-like scientists who believed that UFOs were interdimensional intelligence or a new emerging consciousness. She didn't expect to hear about altered realities, angels, demons, or an organic information network in relationship to UFOs. That all surprised her. And she realized that UFOs, the whole topic, it's an ongoing event for some people. You don't just get abducted once and you're good. Many of these contactees, it's gone throughout their lives. And they include many elements, these experiences, beyond just, oh, look, that looks like a spaceship. Just sighting something. She says they're often very spiritual. And she believes it's an emerging spiritual reanimation of the globe. Jacques Vallée, she says that the most significant aspect of the UFO phenomenon is the impact on society at the level of myth. And he thinks this is a new form of religion. So they're kind of saying the same thing, but what they're both saying is that religious mystical experience, mythology, lore, ghost stories, UFO experiences, we're talking about interpretations of the same phenomenon, a growing new consciousness for humankind. Chapter 1. Chapter 1, The Space Psychologist. This is such an interesting story. So she starts with the transcript from Apollo 10 of the communication. And the astronauts, they're talking to NASA, they're talking to each other, they have the little headsets on, ground control, and they're discussing these weird things they're hearing. They talk about hearing outer space music and whistling. We're not talking about the sound of wind. There is no atmosphere in space. Let's just be clear on that. So the author talks with Tyler, who is trying to stay anonymous, and they decide to join Jacques Vallée and Gary Nolan in Palo Alto, California. And this is around the time the SpaceX rocket had just exploded. And Tyler, really interesting character, he warns her that tell your kids all about this because they're at a perfect age for targeted recruitment. Now, this is around the 3rd grade, 9 or 10 years old. And he wants her to warn her children because, as we're going to find out, he knows that there is targeted recruitment by the secret space program to get kids that are really smart, of a certain kind of personality or intelligence, or a certain family type, and she would be the perfect kind of person to get them drawn into this program. And it really does affect their lives. It can be quite traumatic. And so he's warning them, people start approaching you for special programs or be discerning. Just use discernment. So that's something we should all be aware of. You just use discernment with your children and grandchildren, what they're getting involved in. It's okay to be a little skeptical about the legitimacy or the source of these programs. Very conspiratorial, and yet it happened, as we're going to find out. So Tyler worked with SpaceX. He worked with NASA, the Department of Defense, the U.S. Air Force, and, they vet people who work with them for emotional and mental stability. So it's a given. And he would know about marketing space programs and jobs to kids because it happened to him. He was a mission controller at Cape Canaveral, and he told her that a trip to Mars was a one-way ticket, and he felt that there's kind of a push these days to encourage children to be attracted to this situation. They should go into it with their eyes open, he says, because what they're not being told is there's no way to bring them back. If they go to Mars, on Elon Musk's little gadget, they're not going to come back to their families. And Tyler believes that families should be aware of this. So he enjoyed describing being in weight loss, a weightless free fall, and making him vomit because he went through these things. He said he was viewing Earth from outside the atmosphere, which creates a shock and a trauma, a shift in worldview. And we're going to talk about this a little later. There's actually a term for it, which I forget, but we are going to get to it. And it really does affect people psychologically. William Shatner talks about it. So he says that there's a new consciousness, what he calls a novel consciousness being created, being evolved, and it can create new truths for people who experience space travel. So astronauts and super high pilots, high in the atmosphere pilots, experience these emotional and psychological shifts. And it requires a new vocabulary, which are actually kind of the remembrance of lost religious ideas. So, for example, Edgar Mitchell. Edgar Mitchell took the view of the Earth as a blue ball in space. He said it changed his life. He equated the moment with an ecstatic religious experience in Hindu or Buddhist texts called samadhi. You can see pictures of Paramahansa Yogananda experiencing samadhi. It's an altered state. It's a feeling of the mind and the body. It's not just, oh, look out the window, there's the Earth, isn't that pretty? He said, no, there's this internal emotional thing that happens, and it's about your connection to reality. It's difficult to find the vocabulary because it's indescribable. And interesting term coming up that Stefan Schwartz used quite a bit, numinous. And the closest definition for numinous is holy. It comes from Latin, holy. It's the feeling of being in the presence of some awesome power and simultaneously a power that's simultaneously mysterious, dreadful, fascinating, and indescribable. We do not have the brain power. So we assume the religious or spiritual experiences are full of joy, the Blessed Mother with the Holy Spirit. It's way more complicated than that. Experiencers often feel, this is a very popular term these days, unhinged, which means separated from reality. In the Old Testament, the Bible, the prophets flee when God comes knocking. For example, William Shatner, Star Trek, Captain Kirk, in his 90s, got to go into outer space, which I think is just, what a lovely situation. So he goes into space and in 2021, and he said he cried. He said he cried from grief because space is like death. He said, the earth is like life, and you go into outer space, you are leaving life behind. Now, there's some philosophy from an actor. And he himself said, being in outer space, looking out the window and seeing the earth from a great distance, he said it was a brush with the numinous, the holy. Now, Dr. Whitley, the space psychologist, her job is to support astronauts and pilots and to prepare them for this. And it's like a psychological matrix. And she said she has defined 36 groups of challenges that are related to this space experience that are required to acclimate people to this new mental state and the shock of the new consciousness. Excuse me. So the author's first contact with the space psychologist. She got an email headed 2020. She's called Developing Communication, means an unknown phenomenon. And the author of the book here thought that Dr. Whitley was brave to reach out with her real name. So she got this email from Dr. Whitley and wanted to talk about this and was willing to associate her name in public with these ideas. And Dr. Pasulka, our author, her experience is that people try to distance themselves because there's just not acceptance in the scientific world anyway. She was really used to dealing with anonymous scientists, so she was really surprised to find that this psychologist was a legit person working with the government, working with NASA, and willing to talk. So Dr. Whitley was stuck in South America doing research when COVID shut all the borders, and so she had to stay. She couldn't travel. And she was busy country hopping as borders closed behind her. She was trying to get home, and it took a while for everybody to respond the same way. And she claimed it wasn't difficult for her. Now listen to what this woman does. This woman's a genius. She's a remarkable individual. I can't relate. Okay, she's into skydiving. She's into scuba diving. She researches. She's an expert in researching extreme environments. Already, I'm out. But this is her forte. Her area is cognitive engineering, which is melding of psychology with computer science. And she monitors the well-being of astronauts in space. I mean, talk about your niche profession. And she explained that as astronauts went farther and farther, our rules, beliefs, and behavior go out the window, and they develop a new idea of what is and is not acceptable. And it's very different from global Earth society. Very different. And it's shocking and unacceptable in some contexts, and even for them, but it seemed natural in their new surroundings. So it's a whole new paradigm up there. And therefore, it requires the development of a whole new form of consciousness, and the consciousness they need has to be congruent with this new environment. So it creates psychological states that are specific to only space travel. Oh, and here's the terminology for it. It's the overview effect. It's an encounter with the numinous on seeing Earth from afar, as William Shatner described, as Edgar Mitchell described. It's realizing the inherent unity of humanity, the oneness of everybody on the planet, and it's a shift of perception from parts of the earth, country, direction on the compass, to the whole earth system, all of us as a whole, the planet as a whole. The astronaut becomes the sensing element for all human beings. And it was hoped that they would come back with descriptions and photos that would spread this overview effect to people on Earth, but you have to go through it to feel it. They hope to create an immersive technology to replicate the effect, and no luck. Astronauts say it's a feeling, it's visceral, and the photos, they just don't convey it. Words don't convey it. The other effect is a feeling of non-conforming. And this sense of non-conforming grows as distance from the Earth increases. It's like a disconnect. So they look for astronauts. They use this in recruiting. They look for astronauts who can flourish in extreme environments and who are really good at self-control, especially emotional control under stressful situations, that are good at hiding their dread, fear, panic. And one of the reasons is because these astronauts are using and are in control of billions of dollars of equipment, and they need to be rested and rational and stable and non-emotionally reactive. You know who would be good at that? Psychopaths, because they are not emotional. And they're very much in control of their reactions. And remember, psychopath does not equal serial killer. Serial killers are psychopaths, but the vast number of psychopaths don't commit those kind of crimes. But there are people who are at best emotionally blunted, usually devoid of emotional reactivity. They make great neurosurgeons, I'm just saying. So Skylab 4 astronauts, some of them had to quit doing their work in the Skylab because they were distracted by the floating. They were having too much fun. They weren't getting work done. So Whitley developed techniques and technology to prevent psychological issues in space. This is her job. And so her job is to ID fatigue, to recognize it before it happens, basically, and the effects of sleep deprivation, which can play tricks with your mind. So she made devices that can diagnose fatigue in your voice before anybody realizes. You don't even know you're tired. Your voice starts to change timbre, and she developed machines that can diagnose that. She also helped create tools to identify changes in consciousness from the space environment. And this global shift in perspective in outer space, this was predicted. In 1917, Walter Benjamin wrote an essay that talked about the shift in perspective towards celestial objects. He discussed the individual's singular experience. So the example he used is the telescope, and the essay is called To the Planetarium. And he talked about mourning the loss of the shared experience. Not everybody gets to go into outer space. And at the time he wrote this, very few people had really gotten to experience looking at the sky with a telescope. And he predicted the technology would bring a whole new view, that it was inevitable, that it would bring this whole new perspective, and it would be an historical shift. He really couldn't predict the interface, computers and stuff, and he had no idea what it would be like to come face to face with truly alien entities. Astronauts in space describe a sense of fear and trembling and respect when they look down on Earth. This is the description of a numinous or holy experience. Sounds like saints describing religious experiences. Anthropologist Deanna Weibel looks at how this alters astronauts' cosmologies. So this would be a question. You go up into outer space, a fundamentalist Christian, what do you come back as? And she notes the overview effect and also the ultra view effect, which is the most perplexing and disturbing aspect of these new experiences and how it changes their cosmology. She points to similarities in the writing of Hyper Objects by Tim Morton. These are objects that exist but are almost unimaginable. Objects in other dimensions, like platonic solids. Now we're getting into an area that I can't even pretend I understand. So I'm just going to throw out what she wrote and hope somebody out there gets it. Platonic solids are ultra-large objects so big they can only be seen by technological contact, and these objects are transformative. We see them only in parts. You know, it's like the blind men looking at the elephant and they only know the part they're touching. These ultra view objects are hyper objects are that like that. We can only see them in phases, and we slowly begin to comprehend their entirety eventually. And this is looking at outer space through a telescope. This is a perfect example of that. We're in an historical moment right now of hyperobjectivity. Our visibility is changing, and it changes everything for humans. Plato described this with mathematics. Mathematics, technology, and computer language are our bridge to a new perspective. So this is our entree into AI. So keep this in mind. The familiar is replaced with something truly alien, and our worldview completely shifts. We're at this moment. We're so distracted by other things happening on the ground. It does us good to look at a broader perspective of what's happening to us right now. Astronauts describe being sensing elements and experiencing the divine while they're in space. So we're talking about hard-boiled Navy pilot type guys, right? And the human body undergoes this whole thing. This is a physical experience as well as a conscious experience. It's a process of the reception of consciousness when confronted with hyper objects. This is big words, mouthfuls of big words. But they feel the need to transmit this whole experience to others. And there's a sense of awe. It reorients astronauts' lives and goals and values. And as this anthropologist was to discover, you go up into outer space, a fundamentalist Christian, you're very likely to come back with a completely different cosmological view. And she said this is the most powerful method of personal change and growth that we are aware of. And they feel that these experiencers who go out into outer space, travel, for NASA, etc., they feel that ET life is inevitable. This is not even a debate for them. They regard it as a given. Okay, I'm going to read you just a paragraph here. Looking at the universe out there, this is an Apollo astronaut. From my vantage point, I began to realize we don't know crap about anything. We really don't. And at some points in my orbit around the moon, I was sheltered from both the Earth and the sun, so I was in complete darkness. All of a sudden, the star patterns out there became something that I was not ready for. So many stars, I couldn't see one star individually, just a sheet of light. I don't know whether you'd call it spiritual or not, but when I saw the star field out there in a way that nobody else ever has, I had some pretty profound thoughts. We are not unique in the universe. When I came back from my flight, we were all totally exhausted. I would sit in my living room and all these thoughts would come flowing through, so I began writing them down. They flowed from my mind threw a pen onto a piece of paper like I was being guided by something. Didn't know talking about astronauts would lead you to a discussion of automatic writing, but there you go. I am going to stop here because these are very long chapters, and this has been long enough video. I'd like to give everybody a break, time to go get a snack, go get more popcorn, and then return. Keep in mind, a lot of subscribers who listen to these books do them while they're, painting their deck. So I'll be back in a minute, and I hope you're enjoying this. I had forgotten how much I loved this book, and Slunga Foil, Slancha.